Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere that looks perfectly civilized on the surface, all silk gloves and powdered shoulders and tiny sandwiches, but is actually one of the most elaborate social battlefields in human history. We're talking about Regency England, roughly 1810 to 1825, where a woman couldn't vote, couldn't own property once married, couldn't pursue a career, and couldn't say what she actually thought out loud. So instead, she wore it. That's right. While men were off at Parliament pretending to run things, women were having entire conversations through the cut of a sleeve, the tilt of a bonnet, and whether or not they acknowledged you across a ballroom. Before we dive in, if you're actually enjoying this, please like the video and subscribe, but only if it's genuinely doing something for you. A huge thank you to whoever suggested tonight's topic. You have exceptional taste and a suspicious amount of knowledge about Regency necklines, and the channel is better for it. Suggestions like yours are genuinely what shape this whole thing, and I'm grateful every time one lands in the comments. If you haven't already, you can also find us on Spotify now, links in the description if you'd rather drift off through your headphones tonight. Now, dim the lights, put on a fan, pull that blanket up, and let's get comfortable. Because here's what I want you to think about as you settle in. Have you ever wanted to send a very specific message to someone without technically saying anything? Have you ever chosen an outfit as a kind of defense? Have you ever thought, I'm going to wear the most aggressively cheerful colour to this event, and nobody will ever know it's a protest? Did women in 1815 have a secret code for flirting, for refusing, for saying I find you deeply uninteresting with nothing but a fan? Could you really communicate an entire romantic situation through the colour of your gloves? What happened to a woman who dressed wrong? Too bold, too plain, too foreign, too much? And was any of it actually fashion? Or was all of it survival? Congratulations. You've just arrived in Regency England. The year is 1813. You're wearing approximately 14 layers, none of them warm enough, and someone across the drawing room is reading your collar like it's a telegram. Good luck. Let's set the scene before we get to the clothes, because the clothes only make sense once you understand the cage they were decorating. You are a woman in Regency England, which means you exist, socially speaking, in a state of constant performance review. From the moment you're old enough to be presented in polite company, your entire life is a negotiation conducted not in boardrooms or courts, but in drawing rooms, morning visits, and the excruciating ritual of the season. You cannot vote. You cannot, once married, legally own the money in your own pocket. Your education has prepared you for conversation and pianoforte, not philosophy or law. And yet, and here is the quietly magnificent part, women in this era were not passive. They were strategic, fiercely, inventively strategic. And nowhere was that strategy more visible, more layered, or more carefully communicated than in what they put on their bodies every single morning. You wake up, if you are a woman of the middling or upper classes, which is the version of this world we are mostly navigating, in a house that runs on social ritual. Your day is not structured around work in any official sense. It is structured around being seen, evaluated, and correctly placed within a hierarchy so intricate that a single misstep in the wrong drawing room could follow you across 3 counties and 2 seasons. You have no professional ambitions, not because you lack them, but because there is no structure that would receive them. The law does not recognize your financial independence once you marry. The church does not offer you authority. Parliament does not know your name. What you have, and what you are expected to wield with precision, is social capital. And social capital in Regency England is largely visible. It is worn. Think about what that actually means. Every morning getting dressed is not a personal decision. It is a public one. What you wear to a morning call communicates your financial situation, your family connections, your marital status, your understanding of current fashion, and your opinion of the person you are visiting, All before you've said a single word. This is not an exaggeration. This is how the system worked. The women who navigated it successfully were not lucky or merely pretty. They were fluent. They had mastered a language that most of the men around them couldn't even read, and the men, to be clear, were not playing the same game. A gentleman could arrive at a ball in the same blue coat he'd worn to the last 3 balls and be considered reliably dressed. A woman who repeated a gown too visibly within a single season was noted, discussed, and quietly assessed for what the repetition meant. Was it economy? Was it indifference? Was it the particular boldness of a woman who simply did not care what you thought? Each reading carried different social weight. None of them were neutral. This is the world you're navigating. Not a world of grand political speeches or battlefield decisions, but a world of fabric and colour and the precise angle of a bonnet brim. It sounds small from the outside. It was not small. It was the entire available territory, and the women who understood it, who used it deliberately, creatively, sometimes subversively, were doing something that deserves more credit than history has generally given it. They were not decorating themselves. They were arguing in the only language the room would hear, and some of them were extraordinarily good at it. Before you can understand what women were saying with their clothes, you need to understand what the clothes actually were. Because the Regency silhouette is nothing like what you're picturing if you're imagining stiff Victorian corsets and bustles. The Regency look was deceptively simple. High-waisted, column-shaped, often in white or pale muslin that clung rather than obscured. It was inspired by classical antiquity, specifically the idea that ancient Greek women had floated around in draped linen looking effortlessly elegant and probably cold. The empire waist sat just below the bust. The skirt fell straight and narrow. Sleeves could be short puffs or long fitted tubes depending on the occasion and the hour of the day, because yes, there were different rules for morning, afternoon and evening, and getting them wrong was a social event in itself. The construction of the gown was deceptively involved. The fabric was typically lightweight, white or printed muslin, soft cotton, silk for the more prosperous, gauze for evenings when you wanted to look like you were dressed in an appealing cloud. The silhouette aimed at the effortless, which meant the architecture underneath had to work hard to look like it wasn't working at all. A pair of stays provided smooth support under that high waist. Petticoats gave the skirt its fall. The hem might be trimmed in rouleau, small fabric tubes or lace or embroidered borders, because the bottom of the gown was visible, and the visible parts were always doing something. Sleeves told a story on their own. Short-puffed sleeves at the shoulder were the quintessential Regency silhouette. Young, fashionable, correct for evening and warm weather events. Long sleeves in a fitted style were more modest, more appropriate to morning wear, and somewhat more practical for the actual English climate, which was not, as a rule, cooperating with the classical fantasy. Some gowns had long sleeves over an underdress with short sleeves, allowing layers to be removed or added as the occasion demanded. This was pragmatic genius dressed up as fashion, which is essentially the whole story of Regency women's clothing. Colour followed its own strict hierarchy. White dominated for young unmarried women. More on that in considerable detail shortly. But trimmings and accessories introduced colour in controlled, readable doses. A white muslin gown with blue ribbon trim was a specific visual statement. The same gown with yellow trim said something slightly different. The sash colour, the trim colour, the colour of the slippers visible below the hem, all of it contributed to a total picture that a practiced observer could read the way you might read a sentence. Evening dress amplified everything. Lower necklines, finer fabrics, gloves to the elbow, hair dressed with feathers or small jewels, a carefully chosen shawl. The transformation from morning to evening dress was significant enough that a woman looked like a different version of herself, which was partly the point. The season required you to perform multiple roles in a single day: the respectable morning caller, the composed afternoon visitor, the eligible and graceful evening guest. Each required its own costume. Each costume made its own argument. Getting all three right day after day for a 6-month season was an exercise in sustained strategic presentation that would exhaust most modern marketing departments, and it started with understanding the basic uniform. Once you had the architecture, you could begin to speak with it. The moment you walked into a room in Regency England, before you curtsied, before you spoke, before you even made eye contact with anyone, you had already communicated something, because your gown was talking. Colour in this era wasn't decoration, it was vocabulary. White was the lingua franca of unmarried young women, pure, modest, above reproach, and also, not coincidentally, quite expensive to keep clean, which was its own kind of status message. But the moment you started edging away from white, you were editorializing. Pale yellow suggested cheerfulness and accessibility. Deep blue implied elegance and a certain confidence in your own complexion. Black was grief, or occasionally a bold widow who had decided grief looked rather well on her. And colours that were too vivid, too saturated, too aggressively present, those were read as either foreign influence, low breeding, or a woman who had simply stopped caring what you thought, which was somehow the most alarming option of all. The Regency palette for respectable women was, in theory, restrained. Soft and pale for the young, richer and deeper as you aged into a settled position. Pastels dominated for day, blush, lavender, soft green, the palest imaginable yellow. Stronger colours were acceptable for older married women who had earned the right to declare themselves in jewel tones. This was not coincidence. It was a colour-coded map of feminine life stages. You could look at a woman across a ballroom and read, from her colour alone, where she was in the social sequence, young and available, married and established, in mourning, out of mourning and tentatively re-entering the world. The colours were chapters, and everyone in the room was reading. Specific colours carried specific associations that went beyond the general scale of pale to bold. Green was complicated. Certain shades were fashionable, others associated with fairies in folk tradition, others with jealousy in the flower language that ran parallel to dress codes. Purple carried overtones of both mourning and royalty, which made it useful for the recently widowed woman of high birth who wanted to communicate both grief and dignity simultaneously. Red was powerful and risky. Too much red on a young unmarried woman suggested either a foreign upbringing or a boldness that would require some explaining to her mother. Trimmings added another layer of vocabulary on top of the base colour. A pale gown with dark trim was more dramatic and sophisticated than the same gown untrimmed. Ribbon colour, lace colour, embroidered border colour. Each could modify the statement the gown itself was making, the way a tone of voice modifies a sentence. A white gown with black velvet trim in evening wear was striking, confident, a little unconventional. The same gown with pink satin ribbons was something softer, more approachable, more clearly aimed at encouraging rather than impressing. What made all of this quietly remarkable is that women were managing these calculations in real time, every day, without ever being able to state explicitly that they were doing so. You could not sit down at breakfast and announce, "Today I will wear deep blue to signal to Lord whoever that I am interested but not desperate." That was not how the language was spoken. It was spoken fluently or not at all, absorbed through observation, through the fashion magazines, through the comments of mothers and aunts, through watching what worked and what didn't across a season. It was a second language acquired entirely by immersion, and the women who spoke it best could say more with a colour choice than most people manage in a paragraph. If you wanted to have a private conversation in a room full of people watching your every blink, The fan was your instrument. And this was not metaphor. There was an actual, widely understood vocabulary of fan movements that functioned as a social semaphore system across ballrooms, assembly rooms, and drawing rooms from roughly the late 17th century through the Regency period and beyond. A fan held open in front of the face meant, "I am interested in you." A fan snapped shut and tapped on the left cheek meant something entirely different from tapping it on the right. Fanning slowly while making eye contact was an invitation. Fanning quickly while looking elsewhere was a dismissal. Dropping it accidentally on purpose meant we need to speak privately. Carrying it closed and pointed down meant I'm not interested, and I'd like you to register that clearly. An entire flirtation, beginning, middle, complication, and conclusion could play out across a ballroom without a single word exchanged, while everyone nearby assumed you were simply managing the heat. The fan itself was an object of considerable investment. A fine fan, ivory or bone sticks, hand-painted silk or paper leaves, sometimes edged with lace or gilt, was an heirloom, a gift from a wealthy relation, a luxury purchase saved for specifically. A cheap fan was as legible as an expensive one, though it said different things. The quality of the object in your hand communicated your resources. The skill with which you deployed it communicated something altogether more interesting. Your fluency in the language of the room. Different fan gestures covered a remarkable range of social territory. Resting the fan on the right cheek was yes, on the left cheek was no. Drawing the fan across the forehead very slowly meant you were being watched and knew it, a message directed at whoever was making you feel observed. Twirling the fan in the left hand was a message of "we're being watched," directed at a particular recipient. Placing the fan behind the head communicated "do not forget me," a request, or perhaps a small plea, aimed at someone who was about to leave the room. Touching the tip of the fan to the lips was an invitation to kiss, which, in a period when the actual kissing would have happened nowhere near a ballroom, was doing considerable heavy lifting as gestures go. Whether every woman knew every nuance of every gesture is a legitimate historical question. Some scholars argue the full system was more idealized than practiced, a fantasy of secret communication more than a rigorously applied code. But even if only the broad strokes were in common use, those broad strokes were still remarkably functional. Open fan, slow wave, I am receptive. Closed fan, turned away, I am not. Fan to face, gaze maintained, notice me. These did not require a decoder ring, they required only attention and the willingness to act on what you read. What makes the fan so perfectly suited to this environment is that it was always present and always deniable. A fan was a necessary accessory in a hot candle-lit ballroom full of people dancing vigorously in multiple layers of clothing. Using it was inevitable. This meant that a woman could communicate continuously without ever appearing to do anything more than manage her body temperature. It was the perfect instrument for a world in which women were expected to be passive and reactive. The fan allowed them to be neither, while appearing to be both. It is, in retrospect, an elegant solution to a deeply unfair problem, and it fit in a reticule. You would not attend a single formal occasion in Regency England without gloves. This was not optional. Bare hands at a ball were roughly the equivalent of showing up today without shoes, technically not illegal, but extremely hard to explain. But here's where it gets interesting. The rules around gloves were so specific, so loaded, and so frequently deployed as social signals that they deserve their own chapter entirely. Long gloves for evening, shorter ones for day. White for the unmarried, slightly more latitude for the married. The moment a glove was removed, or not removed, at the right moment communicated volumes. Removing a glove to shake hands was a gesture of intimacy and trust. A woman who kept her gloves firmly on while receiving a particular gentleman's hand was politely, unmistakably, absolutely not encouraging him. The colour, the fit, the condition of the gloves, all of it was read, noted and filed away by anyone paying attention, and in Regency England everyone was paying attention. Evening gloves were long, reaching to the elbow or beyond, and were typically white or cream kid leather, so fine they were sometimes described as second skin. Getting them on required assistance and patience. Getting them off required a specific ritual. You removed them finger by finger, slowly, from the top down, which was considered the correct and elegant method. Yanking them off at the wrist was both incorrect and rather alarming. The gloves, once removed at supper, because you ate with bare hands, gloves being impractical during the consumption of cold chicken and syllabub, were held, draped over the wrist, or laid on the supper table, and each of these choices said something about how comfortable you were in the room. During dancing, the gloves stayed on. This was partly practical. The contact between a gentleman's hand and a lady's during the figures of a country dance or a waltz was mitigated, made technically proper by the layer of white kid between them. Remove the gloves, and suddenly the same hand-holding that had been perfectly appropriate became charged with a directness that was not considered suitable. The glove was, in this sense, doing the work of a chaperone in miniature, present, thin, and almost entirely symbolic, but absolutely necessary. The condition of your gloves was its own kind of communication. Fresh, pristine, correctly fitted gloves announced care, resources, and attentiveness. Gloves that were slightly worn, slightly loose at the fingers, or worse, slightly stained, communicated either poverty or carelessness. And the distinction between those two readings was itself a social judgment. A woman from a known wealthy family in slightly worn gloves was eccentric or indifferent. A woman from an unknown or modest family in the same condition was struggling, and the room would note it with varying degrees of sympathy. Giving gloves was a recognised gesture of romantic interest. A man might present a woman with a pair of gloves as a gift, and accepting them carried implications. There are accounts in the period's correspondence of women puzzling over whether to accept gloves from a gentleman who had not declared himself, because to wear them was to wear his gesture in public. To return them was a clear refusal. To accept and not wear them was a middle position that satisfied no one and confused everyone, which in the context of Regency courtship made it entirely understandable. The glove was never just a glove. It was a small, white, enormously consequential piece of leather, doing approximately all of the emotional heavy lifting for everyone in the room. The bonnet was not merely a hat. Do not make the mistake of thinking it was merely a hat. In Regency England, the bonnet was the single most visible, most adjustable, most personally expressive item in a woman's entire wardrobe, and unlike a gown that required a seamstress and a budget, a bonnet could be retrimmed at home with new ribbons, new flowers, new feathers to communicate something entirely different from what it said last Tuesday. The style of bonnet, how wide the brim, how high the crown, how far forward it tilted changed what your face communicated before your face could say anything on its own. A poke bonnet with an extremely deep brim was practically a privacy screen. It meant you could see perfectly well, but you were choosing not to be seen unless you turned your head directly towards someone, which was itself a deliberate act. A bonnet trimmed lavishly in a fashionable style said, "I am current, I am connected, I know what's happening in London." A bonnet that was slightly out of fashion said one of two things. Either this woman has no money, or this woman has enough money that she doesn't care. Bonnet shapes shifted dramatically across the Regency period, and following those shifts, or choosing not to, was itself a statement. In the early 1800s, the brim was relatively modest, framing the face without overwhelming it. By the 18-teens, the poke bonnet had become fashionable, that dramatically deep brim that projected forward and turned the wearer's face into something you could only see from directly in front, and only if she wanted you to. It was the sartorial equivalent of reading terms and conditions, technically visible but requiring considerable commitment. The women who wore the deepest poke bonnets were either extremely fashionable or extremely not interested in being approached, and sometimes both simultaneously. The trimming of a bonnet was where real personality entered the equation. Ribbons in a particular colour could echo the dress or contradict it. A pale dress with a bonnet trimmed in deep blue ribbon was a more forceful statement than the same dress with matching ribbons, and the forcefulness was legible. Flowers added their own layer of meaning through the florography system that ran parallel to all of this. A bonnet trimmed with artificial forget-me-nots was not a casual aesthetic choice in a world where forget-me-nots meant remembrance and fidelity. Feathers communicated fashion-forwardness and a certain boldness. Exotic feathers, ostrich plumes, anything that moved with your head were expensive and visible and knew it. A simple ribbon bow communicated restraint, economy, or youth. The bonnet you assembled from your available materials was a small, wearable manifesto sitting on your head at all times. The bonnet also governed the terms of public encounter. In a society where a man was not supposed to speak to a woman to whom he had not been properly introduced, the bonnet brim created a practical architecture of avoidance. A woman could walk down a street, see someone she was not in a position to acknowledge, and simply not turn her head. The bonnet did the work. There was no need for the awkward overhead of visible, deliberate snubbing. You simply had not seen them, because your bonnet had not pointed in that direction. Likewise, a slight turn of the head, a tilting of the brim towards someone, was itself a greeting before the words of greeting arrived. You were turning the aperture of your visibility toward a person. That was a choice. They knew it was a choice. Everybody knew. The bonnet was a remarkably sophisticated piece of social technology, and it sat on your head and cost considerably less than a new gown, which made it one of the most efficiently deployed tools in the whole wardrobe. Nobody, it turns out, respects a good hat the way it deserves. A woman who understood fashion in Regency England understood that fabric was not a neutral choice. Every textile told a story about your income, your connections, your politics, and occasionally your relationship with the continent. Muslin was the great democratizer, light, relatively affordable, easily washed, and during the height of the Regency it was everywhere, to the point where anxious doctors and commentators wrote alarmed pamphlets about young women wearing damp muslin in cold weather and contracting muslin disease, which was a charmingly Victorian way of saying pneumonia and a very non-Victorian way of blaming the fabric. Silk was prosperity made visible. Velvet was prosperity that had been around long enough not to need to shout about it. Indian cotton, French lace, and Kashmiri shawls were sophisticated and international. But during the long years of the Napoleonic Wars, French fabric carried a very specific charge. Wearing it when French goods were embargoed was either brave, oblivious, or connected to smuggling, and all three possibilities were socially fascinating. Muslin deserves its own extended consideration because the period's relationship with it was genuinely unhinged in the best possible way. Fine Indian muslin, the kind described in contemporary accounts as woven air, was so sheer that wearing it with nothing underneath was a rather optimistic decision for a northern European climate. There were stories, possibly apocryphal but widely repeated, of fashionable women dampening their muslin gowns to make them cling more dramatically to the figure. Whether this actually happened with any frequency, or whether it was largely a moral panic invented by men who found the silhouettes simultaneously appealing and alarming, the stories tell you something about how legible fabric had become as a social signal. Sheer muslin was youth, modernity, fashion, and a certain lightness of spirit. Heavy brocade was your grandmother's generation. Which gown you wore told people which century you thought you were living in. Silk communicated wealth and its gradations. Plain silk was prosperous. Shot silk, woven with two colours so it shifted in the light, was sophisticated and expensive. Figured silk with woven patterns in the fabric itself was established wealth. Satin was formal. Crepe was mourning. Gauze was the evening version of muslin. Delicate, slightly transparent, entirely impractical, and therefore deeply fashionable in the context of an event where you were not required to do anything practical. The choice among these was not purely aesthetic. It was a declaration of resources, of social position, of how seriously you were presenting yourself at this particular occasion. Lace was its own category of communication, entirely separate from the fabric beneath it. Brussels lace was the finest and most expensive. Honiton lace was English, patriotic, and beautiful. Cheap cotton lace was imitative and legible as such to anyone who knew the difference, which was everyone in any room you were likely to care about. The lace at your collar, your cuffs, the hem of your cap, the width of it, the pattern of it, the quality of the thread could be assessed from across a room by a practiced eye. You were walking around draped in financial disclosure documents. The only thing missing was an audit. What is remarkable about all of this is that women navigated this landscape daily, and largely unconsciously. The fluency was absorbed so thoroughly that it became instinct. You did not think, "I will wear fine muslin to announce my youth and my family's fashionability." You simply knew what to wear and wore it. The language was in the hands before it was in the head, which makes it, in the most literal sense possible, a kind of mother tongue. If the Regency era had a single-lit accessory, the one item that crossed class lines, inspired obsession, and was faked, copied, and hoarded with equal fervour, it was the kashmir shawl. Woven in northern India from the impossibly fine wool of a specific Himalayan goat, a genuine kashmir shawl was so soft it could be pulled through a finger ring, and so tightly woven that its intricate paisley patterns looked less like textile, and more like something a particularly patient deity had embroidered over several years. They arrived in England through the networks of the East India Company and through the luggage of British officers' wives returning from India. They were expensive enough to be listed in wills. They were given as engagement gifts. They were worn draped over empire waist gowns in the manner of a Greek statue that had stumbled into the best possible trade route. And a woman carrying a genuine kashmir shawl, not a Norwich knockoff, not a paisley imitation, but the real thing, was walking around with a small empire's worth of luxury thrown over her shoulders, and everyone who knew anything knew it. The price of a genuine kashmir shawl in the Regency era was staggering, equivalent to a significant portion of a year's income for a middling family. This was not a practical purchase. It was not purchased for warmth in any serious sense, though it was remarkably warm for its weight, another miracle of its construction. It was purchased because owning it communicated something that could not be communicated any other way. That you had access to the networks that moved luxury goods across continents, that you or your husband or your father had sufficient connection to empire to have acquired something that took months to reach English shores, and that you could afford to drape this investment casually over your shoulders at a morning call as though it were perfectly ordinary. Conspicuous consumption has always existed. The kashmir shawl was simply its most elegant Regency expression. The demand was so ferocious, and the genuine article so expensive that British manufacturers moved quickly to produce imitations. Paisley in Scotland and Norwich in England both developed weaving traditions specifically designed to replicate the kashmir shawl's distinctive patterns, the curved flame-like bottom motif that Western weavers called the Paisley. Though the original had been woven in India for centuries, these imitations were beautiful, genuinely skilled pieces of textile work, and they were also, to a practiced eye, immediately identifiable as not the real thing. The weave structure was different, the weight was different. The colours, however finely executed, sat slightly differently on the fabric. And owning a Paisley shawl, while entirely respectable, announced something categorically different from owning a cashmere. It announced that you admired the aesthetic but not the access. The draping of the shawl mattered as much as the shawl itself. Thrown on anyhow was not the point. A shawl draped with skill and apparent effortlessness, arranged to display the pattern to advantage, settled over the arms in a way that suggested it had landed there naturally, required practice. Ladies' maids developed specific techniques. Women practiced the arrangement in their rooms before going out, the way a modern person might spend unreasonable amounts of time on a photograph before posting it, except that the shawl draping happened in real time in a front of an audience, which is considerably higher stakes. The shawl was simultaneously warmth, wealth, fashion, and a small performance of relaxed elegance that was anything but relaxed. Napoleon's Empress Josephine reportedly owned hundreds of them. The Regency Englishwoman with one genuine cashmere was doing extremely well. The one with two was barely trying to hide how pleased she was about it. For upper and middle-class women without independent fortunes, the London season was essentially a hiring fair with ball gowns. It ran roughly from January through June, the period when Parliament sat and fashionable families decamped from their country estates to town, and it was during these months that the marriage market operated at full capacity. You attended balls, morning calls, Almack's assembly rooms on Wednesday nights, drives in Hyde Park, opera performances, and an almost inhuman number of card parties, and at every single one of these events, you were being evaluated. Your dress at each occasion was your opening statement. Too plain, and you were either poor or indifferent. Too ornate, and you were trying too hard, which was the social equivalent of arriving to a job interview and immediately listing all your weaknesses. The ideal was studied effortlessness, an ensemble that appeared natural while being the result of considerable time, expense, and planning. The financial investment required to participate in the season properly was, for families of modest means, genuinely alarming. A young woman needed morning dresses, carriage dresses, walking dresses, evening gowns, ball gowns. She needed these things in sufficient variety that she was not visibly repeating herself across events attended by the same people. She needed them to be current, not last year's silhouette, not last season's trim. She needed shoes and gloves and fans and headdresses and shawls to accompany each configuration. And she needed all of this at a moment in her life when she had not yet secured the marriage that would theoretically justify the investment. The entire enterprise was a bet placed on a future that had not arrived. The clothes were the wager. Mothers managed this budget with a strategic focus that would not embarrass a military campaign. The most important occasions received the finest gowns. Minor events could be covered with refreshed versions of existing dresses, new trim, new ribbon, a different arrangement of the same accessories. A skilled lady's maid was essential to this economy. She could update a gown between events in ways that made it unrecognizable to the casual observer. The sheer logistics of appearing appropriately dressed at the correct level of investment for each distinct type of occasion, day after day for 6 months, while simultaneously managing the social dynamics of the actual marriage market, was a project of sustained complexity, and the women who executed it without visible effort were considered the most accomplished of all. The season also had a particular anxiety baked into it that the dress code amplified. Every woman who came to London for the season had a deadline, even if no one said so aloud. Multiple seasons without a proposal was noted. 3 seasons was beginning to be discussed. 4 was ominous. And the dress across multiple seasons told a story that people read with unkind precision. Was she fresher this year? Had the family invested more heavily? Had there been a disappointment last season that could be read in the slightly more careful, slightly more deliberate choices of this one? The gowns were the visible record of the pursuit, and the pursuit was, for most of these women, the only large-scale project their world was going to offer them. They dressed for it accordingly. There was one venue in Regency London so exclusive, so socially decisive, and so merciless in its enforcement of dress codes that being refused entry could effectively end a young woman's marriageability for the entire season. That venue was Almack's Assembly Rooms on King Street, and the women who controlled its weekly Wednesday night balls, the lady patronesses, a committee of aristocratic grandees who made the sorting hat look casual, held more actual power over young women's futures than most official institutions of the era. The rules were not posted but were known by anyone who mattered. No trousers for men, no décolletage that strayed too far, nothing too French during the war years, and absolutely nothing that suggested you hadn't taken the whole enterprise seriously. The Duke of Wellington himself was once turned away for arriving in trousers rather than knee breeches. If the Iron Duke of Waterloo could be bounced at the door, imagine what happened to a country girl with a slightly provincial bonnet. Almack's admission was governed by vouchers, small cards issued personally by the lady patronesses, which gave you the right to attend. Obtaining a voucher required social connections, a correct reputation, and the approval of women who had both the taste and the temperament to refuse people for reasons they were under no obligation to explain. The patronesses in the Regency period included figures like Lady Jersey, Lady Castlereagh, and Princess Esterhazy, women of extraordinary social power who understood perfectly well what they possessed and exercised it with precision. Being refused a voucher was not a small thing. It was a public declaration that you had not met the standard, and the standard, while never officially stated, was communicated in the dress and bearing of every woman who had succeeded in getting through the door. The dress code at Almack's was not primarily about modesty or formality in the abstract. It was about the correct kind of formality, the kind that demonstrated you understood the room, respected its conventions, and had the resources and connections to dress accordingly. A gown that would have been perfectly acceptable at a private ball might be considered insufficient for Almack's because it lacked the precision, the fashionability, or the level of finish that the assembly rooms demanded. Conversely, a gown that was too extravagant, too theatrical, too clearly trying, that was also wrong. Almack's required the particular social intelligence of the middle register, formal enough, fashionable enough, composed enough, and not so much of any of these things that it looked like effort. The food at Almack's was famously terrible. Thin bread and butter, weak lemonade, stale cake. The dancing was regimented. The room itself was not, by most accounts, particularly beautiful. None of this mattered. What mattered was that the most eligible men in London were in the room, that the most formidable women in London were watching the door, and that being present and correctly dressed was a social credential that followed you through the rest of the season and beyond. Women wrote home about it. Mothers planned for it years in advance. The Wednesday night voucher was a small piece of paper that determined a great deal about how the next 6 months, and potentially the rest of your life, would unfold. The food was genuinely dreadful, though. Several diaries confirm this. Even the most socially ambitious women drew a line at the lemonade. Death in Regency England was not a private event. It was a social one, and your clothes were the announcement. Mourning dress was a precise, elaborate, and strictly tiered system that told everyone around you exactly who had died, how closely related to you they were, and how far along in the grieving process you currently stood. Full mourning, the immediate aftermath of a death in the immediate family, meant unrelieved black from head to toe. Not fashionable black, not elegant black. Flat, matte, crepe-trimmed black that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, because even a glossy fabric was considered insufficiently sorrowful. After a set number of months, the exact duration depending on the relationship to the deceased, you entered half mourning, where grey, lavender, and white were cautiously reintroduced. The transition mattered because it was public. People noted when you shifted out of full mourning and whether you did it too quickly, which implied insufficient grief, or too slowly, which implied either excessive grief or, more interestingly, a strategic decision to remain visually unavailable. The timeline of mourning was not left to personal judgment. It was socially prescribed with a specificity that left very little room for interpretation. A husband's death required the longest mourning, typically 2 years in full and half mourning combined. A parent or child required a year, a sibling 6 months. More distant relatives were assigned progressively shorter periods, down to a few weeks for a cousin once removed who you'd never particularly liked, but were nonetheless required to acknowledge publicly had existed and departed. The gradations were known. Wearing full mourning for a first cousin when a parent's mourning period had not yet concluded was a sartorial error with social consequences. Getting the hierarchy wrong was, in the logic of the era, a failure of both taste and feeling. The fabric of mourning dress was itself a statement of investment in grief. Crepe, a crimped matte silk textile that did not reflect light, was the defining material of full mourning, and it was expensive, uncomfortable, and remarkably unforgiving of the English weather, which had opinions about silk in the rain. Bombazine, a heavier wool-silk blend, was another mourning staple. These fabrics were not worn because they were pleasant. They were worn because they were visibly, undeniably, expensive signals of correct feeling. A woman who could not afford proper crepe and mourned in cheaper materials was marking her grief as genuine but her resources as limited, which was a complicated position to occupy in a room full of people reading both messages simultaneously. The transition to half mourning introduced its own negotiations. Lavender was the first colour cautiously readmitted, soft, not quite purple, not quite grey, hovering at the edge of colour without fully committing to it. Then white, then, carefully, grey. The reintroduction of colour was watched. Moving through half mourning too quickly suggested the deceased had not been sufficiently valued. Lingering in full mourning beyond the prescribed period could suggest genuine devastation, sympathetic certainly, but also a strategic choice, particularly for widows who had reasons to remain visually unavailable to suitors while they assessed their new situation. Because a widow's situation was, financially and socially, genuinely complex. She had mourning dress and she had independence, possibly for the first time in her adult life, and the dress code governed how visibly she was exercising the latter while performing the former. The black gown was simultaneously grief and armour, the lavender of half mourning simultaneously a softening and a signal that the armour was cautiously being put down. It was a performance of the motion with a precise social choreography. The grief may have been entirely real. In Regency England, even real grief came with a dress code, a timeline, and an audience who would notice if you deviated from either. Evening dress in the Regency era was low-cut, sometimes dramatically, aggressively, memorably low-cut, and this was perfectly acceptable within its context, which was the crucial point about all Regency dress codes. What was appropriate at a formal evening ball would have been scandalous on a morning call, borderline on a walk in the park, and potentially catastrophic in a church. The rules were not about covering up per se, they were about reading the room with absolute precision. A décolletage that was admired at the Duchess of Devonshire's route became fast and alarming when a woman appeared in public in the afternoon wearing something cut in the same spirit. The same neckline that said confidence and fashion at 10 at night said something entirely different at 11 in the morning, and the difference between those two readings could follow a woman around for a season. This meant that getting dressed required not just aesthetic judgment, but something closer to social calculation. Where am I going? Who will be there? What do I want them to conclude? The logic was not actually arbitrary, even if the rules were strict. Formal evening events, balls, concerts, theatrical performances, grand dinners were occasions of display. They were the moments at which the social body assembled to perform itself, to see and be seen in the most explicitly performative register the culture offered. Low necklines at a ball were not immodest within that context. They were correct. They were what the occasion demanded. The woman who arrived at a ball in a high-necked daytime gown was as conspicuous as the woman who arrived at a morning call in a ball gown. Both had misread the room, and misreading the room was the error, not the neckline itself. The precise degree of décolletage that was considered appropriate varied by age, marital status, and occasion. Young unmarried women wore lower necklines than their mothers in some contexts, higher in others. The rules were layered enough that no single summary captures them cleanly, which was precisely the point. The complexity was the barrier. A woman who had been properly educated in the social codes of her class understood the gradations instinctively. A woman who had not was identifiable by the missteps, which were small in themselves but accumulated into a portrait of someone who did not quite belong. Older married women had considerably more latitude in evening dress than their daughters. A matron in her 30s with an established social position could wear a neckline that would have been considered too bold on her unmarried niece, not because the physical fact of the neckline was different, but because the social reading of it was. The matron was not in the marriage market. She was not sending signals that required the same careful management. She was, in the vocabulary of the room, speaking from a position of security rather than negotiation, and the room adjusted its reading accordingly. What made the décolletage calculation so genuinely demanding was that it required perfect environmental awareness. You were not dressing for one pair of eyes or one occasion. You were dressing for an entire room of readers who brought different frameworks and different interests to what they saw. A gentleman caller read your neckline differently from your hostess. Your hostess read it differently from the woman across the room who was deciding whether to introduce you to her son. Getting it right meant finding the precise point on the spectrum that read as correct to all of them simultaneously. It was, if you think about it, an extremely difficult calibration problem. The Regency woman who navigated it successfully every evening of the season was performing a feat of social engineering that she would never, in the language available to her, have been permitted to call by that name. Before mass production made clothing anonymous, every garment was to some degree a handmade object, and in Regency England, the needlework that decorated a woman's dress, cap, shawl or handkerchief was often done by her own hands. This matters because embroidery wasn't purely decorative. It was communicative. A handkerchief embroidered with a particular motif was a calling card. Specific flowers carried specific meanings. The same vocabulary that applied to posies and bouquets applied to the thing stitched into collars and cuffs. Roses for love, obviously. Forget-me-nots for remembrance and fidelity. Pansies for thoughts, specifically the kind of thoughts you were having about a specific person. A woman who presented a gentleman with a handkerchief embroidered in forget-me-nots was not being clumsy about symbolism. She was being precise. and because the handkerchief was personal property, something touched, carried, given, its symbolism was understood to be intentional in a way that a gown's trim might not have been. The skill of needlework was one of the central competences a gentlewoman was expected to possess, alongside music, drawing, and the ability to speak at least conversational French. But skill and communication were different things, and the women who understood the language embedded in needlework were using both simultaneously. A well-executed piece of embroidery demonstrated patient industry and refined taste, qualities the era prized in women as evidence of correct feminine character. The same piece, if its imagery was chosen deliberately, was also saying something specific to a specific person. The audience for the skill was general. The audience for the meaning was sometimes an audience of one. White work, white embroidery on white fabric, worked in varying textures and densities, was the most fashionable embroidery style of the Regency period and the most technically demanding. A woman whose muslin gown featured fine white work embroidery on the hem and cuffs had invested considerable hours in the making of her own garment. This communicated something that purchased trim could not: personal industry, personal skill, and a relationship to the gown that was intimate and proprietary. She had made this. It carried her hands in it. When she wore it in public, she was displaying not only the finished object, but the hours and attention that had produced it, which were themselves a kind of self-portrait. Motifs carried consistent meaning across the decorative language of the period. The oak leaf communicated strength and longevity. The ivy communicated loyalty and attachment, ivy being the plant that will follow a structure anywhere, which was either a romantic or a slightly alarming image depending on your perspective on attachment. Lilies of the valley meant the return of happiness, a message that, stitched into the hem of a gown worn to a particular occasion, was directed at someone who would understand its timing. Primroses meant youth and young love. The bluebell meant constancy. Together these formed a vocabulary that was widely enough understood to function as communication, while being sufficiently deniable to protect the communicator if the message was unwelcome. What is striking about this system, looking back at it, is how much labour it placed in the service of saying things that could not be said directly. A woman could not approach a man at a ball and tell him she had not stopped thinking about him since Tuesday. She could embroider pansies, whose very name derived from the French word for thoughts, into the border of a handkerchief and present it to him, and the message was the same. The stitches were the speech. The needle was the voice, and every woman in the room who knew the code, which was most of them, was reading the embroidery the way you'd read a letter slipped under a door. Small, specific, and meant for someone. Floriography, the coded language of flowers, reached peak cultural saturation in the Victorian era, but its roots were firmly planted in the Regency, imported partly through Turkish and Persian court traditions, and partly through the simple human desire to say things you couldn't say out loud. Women wore flowers. They wore them in their hair, pinned at their bodice, tucked into gloves, presented in small arrangements called tussy-mussies that they carried or gave away. And the choice of flower was not arbitrary. A red rose was love, but a yellow rose was jealousy, and a white rose was silence or secrecy, which was a very specific and interesting thing to wear to a party. Lavender meant devotion. Rosemary was remembrance. Violets were modesty. Daffodils were unrequited love, which, if you showed up to a man's home carrying them, was either a very bold or a very miscalculated move. The whole system required fluency on both ends to function. The sender had to know the vocabulary and so did the receiver, which meant that fashionable young women were effectively studying a second language made entirely of plants. The tussy-mussy was the most deliberately composed of these flower communications. A small, tightly arranged nosegay, often held in a small silver or filigree holder. The tussie-mussy was assembled with the care of a short letter. The central flower announced the primary message. The flowers surrounding it modified or supported it. The greenery used as backing carried its own meanings. Rue for regret, bay laurel for achievement and glory, fern for sincerity. Receiving a tussie-mussy required you to read it correctly, which meant that fashionable young women kept flower dictionaries, actual dictionaries, of flowers. This is a real thing that existed and was consulted. The Victorian era would eventually publish elaborate florography guides, but the practice in the Regency was widespread enough that the reference materials were already in circulation. You did your flower homework or you risked a catastrophic misread. A woman wearing flowers at her bodice was making a statement about her current state of feeling that was accessible to anyone who spoke the language. Violets for Modesty said, "I am not here to impress you." Myrtle, associated with Venus, with love and marriage, at the bodice of a woman in conversation with a particular gentleman, was essentially a footnote in the margin of that conversation. Lily of the Valley said she was happy, or wished to appear so, or was hoping for a return of happiness from a specific source. Pansies again meant thoughts. A woman wearing pansies at her bodice while talking to a man she'd been thinking about was being perfectly legible to every woman in the room who was paying attention. The men, it should be noted, were frequently not paying this level of attention, which was possibly the entire point. The flowers also had to be fresh, which meant they had to be sourced with care. In London, flower sellers were available and widely used. A woman who appeared at an evening event with a fresh, carefully chosen arrangement had planned it before she left the house. The planning was part of the communication. These flowers were not accidental, and their presence was a decision made in private that was then worn in public. The gap between this private decision and the public wearing was where the message lived. She had thought about him before she arrived. The flower said so, and the women who read flowers could see it clearly from across the room, while the object of the communication stood nearby entirely unsuspecting, wondering why the evening felt charged with something he couldn't quite identify. The flowers knew. They always knew. Your hair in Regency England was not your hair in the sense of a personal decision you made on a Tuesday morning. It was an argument. The dominant style of the early Regency was Grecian-inspired, short curls framing the face, the rest swept up into loose knots, decorated with combs, ribbons or small jewelled pins. But the specific execution of that general principle communicated everything from your age to your marital status, to whether you'd recently been in London or languishing in the country with access only to last year's fashion plates. A young, unmarried woman wore her hair differently from a married matron. A widow had her own set of conventions. Too many curls was thought girlish and overworked. Too severe was either fashionably modern or slightly alarming depending on the company. And a hairstyle that clearly referenced something French, the chignon, the crop, anything that had been photographed on a French empress, was either sophisticated or politically suspect depending on where you were in the timeline of the Napoleonic Wars. The physical process of Regency hairdressing was, by modern standards, an investment. Fine hair required curling papers or heated tongs, the latter being a genuinely hazardous tool in the hands of a nervous lady's maid, and the results had to survive an evening's worth of dancing in a hot, crowded room. This was not a given. Hair that began the evening in elegant Grecian curls could end it in something that told a rather different story about the structural integrity of the arrangement. This is why married women had an advantage here as elsewhere. A cap, properly placed over dressed hair, solved the problem of maintaining the style while simultaneously communicating the correct marital status. The cap was not purely decorative. It was practical headwear for a woman whose hair was no longer required to do all the work of self-presentation on its own. Ornaments in the hair followed the same language as ornaments everywhere else. Ostrich feathers were fashionable for evening, and the more fashionable a woman was, the more precisely she managed the number, colour, and positioning of the feathers. A single elegant feather was confident. Multiple feathers in different colours was a commitment to spectacle that required a sufficiently grand occasion to justify it. Small jewelled pins or combs communicated wealth in a quiet register, visible only to those close enough to see them, which was itself a statement about the kind of attention you were inviting. Ribbons woven through the hair echoed the ribbons on the gown beneath, creating a visual coherence that communicated deliberate composition rather than random assembly. You had thought about this. The thinking was visible. The haircut itself, a relatively new concept in this era, carried ideological weight. The fashionable crop of the early 1800s, influenced by classical busts and by the revolutionary spirit that had been sweeping through European aesthetic since the 1790s, was worn by women who wanted to identify themselves with modernity and ideas. A woman with closely cropped hair in 1810 was not simply following fashion in a neutral sense. She was aligning herself with a particular cultural moment, one that valued reason, classicism, and a break from the elaborate artificiality of the powdered wig era. Her hair was a political position, admittedly one that required considerably less maintenance than the alternative, which might explain part of its appeal. But the politics were real, and the women who made the choice understood what they were choosing. The hair was never just the hair. Nothing in Regency England was just itself, because Regency gowns were not, structurally speaking, built for the British climate. Thin muslin in November is an optimistic choice at best. Women spent a significant portion of their outdoor lives in outerwear, and the outerwear was doing as much social signalling as the gown underneath. The pelisse was the great all-purpose outer garment of the era, fitted, often in a contrasting colour to the dress beneath, cut to the ankle, and trimmed with everything from fur to braiding to embroidered borders. The pelisse you wore in public was your visible self in a way your ball gown wasn't, because you wore it during the day, during carriage rides, during the ritual of morning calls, during the Hyde Park promenade where being seen was precisely the point. The quality of its cloth, the fashionability of its cut, the elegance of its trim, these were all read and assessed in real time by everyone you passed. A pelisse in excellent condition said, "Things are going well for us." A pelisse that was showing its age said either, "We have hit a difficult patch," or "I am rich enough not to care about coats." The pelisse was essentially a fitted coat that followed the empire waist silhouette of the gown beneath, which meant it revealed rather than obscured the fashionable line. Unlike a heavy cloak that simply covered everything, the pelisse was constructed to show you your shape, your figure, your understanding of current fashion, while simultaneously providing the practical function of keeping the English weather from actually killing you. It was tailored by the same modiste who made your gowns, or should have been, because the fit was important, and the cut was legible from across the street. A well-cut pelisse was a significant investment. It was also, being outerwear, the item most people saw most of the time, which made it a particularly high-stakes piece of the wardrobe to get right. Colour in the pelisse could be read at a distance that colour in a gown's trim could not. A deep jewel-toned pelisse, rich green, dark blue, burgundy, was visible from carriages, from windows, from across the park. It announced fashionability and prosperity with the directness of a headline. A pelisse in a pale or neutral tone was more conservative, more restrained, more careful. The choice of a woman who did not wish to advertise or of one whose resources did not run to the stronger dyes, which were in most cases more expensive. The trim added another layer. Plain pelisses were respectable. Braided military-style pelisses were fashionable in the manner that always attended warfare. The Napoleonic campaigns produced an enormous enthusiasm for military-inflected aesthetics in civilian women's dress, which is one of those historical coincidences that says something rather uncomfortable about the relationship between war and fashion. The redingote was the police's slightly more formal cousin, a long, structured outer garment that crossed into daydress territory in a way the police did not quite manage. Worn for more formal daytime occasions, the redingote was severe, elegant, and carried the kind of authority that came from very good cloth, cut with very great precision. A woman in a well-made redingote looked to contemporary eyes like a woman who was going somewhere important and was dressed accordingly. The garment communicated intention. It said, "I have arranged myself for this." Whatever this was, a significant morning call, a visit to a person or a place that required formality, the redingote announced it before you arrived. Your outer coat was your opening sentence, and in a world where first impressions were everything and second chances were not guaranteed, the opening sentence deserved its full attention. Let's address the stays, because the Regency corset is not what you might imagine, and understanding what it was actually doing helps explain what women's bodies were being asked to communicate. Unlike the Victorian hourglass corset that would come later, the kind that compressed the waist to improbable dimensions and required a second person and a significant commitment to fasten, the Regency corset was comparatively light. It was a pair of stays designed not to reshape the silhouette dramatically, but to provide a smooth, supported foundation for the high-waisted column silhouette. The body was supposed to look natural, classical, unsculpted. This was ideologically significant. The Regency ideal was partly a reaction against the heavily structured late 18th century, all those panniers and powdered wigs, and partly an embrace of Enlightenment ideas about natural virtue and classical beauty. A fashionable body in 1812 was supposed to look as though it had simply arrived that way, which required, paradoxically, a certain amount of engineering. The Regency stays were typically short, ending just below the bust and boned lightly enough to provide structure without dramatic alteration. The goal was a smooth, elevated bust line, and a column that fell cleanly from the empire waist. What you were not supposed to see was any evidence of the stays themselves. The construction was supposed to vanish beneath the muslin, which meant that the engineering had to be precise enough to do its work invisibly. This is a more difficult problem than it sounds. Stays that showed through thin muslin were a failure of the system. Stays that did not hold their shape through an evening of dancing were equally a failure. The garment that nobody was supposed to know about had to perform reliably throughout every occasion at which you were being publicly assessed, demanding conditions for an invisible piece of clothing. What a woman's silhouette communicated in this era was connected to the classical ideal that governed the whole aesthetic. The Greek statue was the reference point. Upright, smooth, naturally proportioned, apparently effortless. A woman whose figure closely approximated this ideal was fashionable in a way that felt pre-approved by antiquity itself, which was the Regency's way of saying both modern and timeless simultaneously, which is every era's favourite thing to say about its own aesthetics. A figure that diverged from this ideal was managed through the stays, the cut of the gown, the drape of the shawl, all the engineering deployed in service of the appearance of nature. It was nature all the way down, and at the bottom of nature was an extremely well-constructed pair of boned stays. The discourse around women's bodies and their relationship to the stays was, predictably, conducted by men with strong opinions and incomplete information. Doctors wrote warnings about tight lacing, a practice that was more associated with later periods than the Regency, but which served as a useful moral panic regardless of actual prevalence. Satirists drew cartoons. Commentators expressed concern. Women wore what was necessary to achieve the fashionable silhouette and generally got on with their days. The body was a vehicle for the dress, and the dress was a vehicle for the social message, and the social message was the actual point. The stays were infrastructure, useful, necessary, entirely invisible, and not half as dramatic as the people who weren't wearing them seemed to find them, which, now that you think about it, describes a great deal of women's work throughout history. Here is a small but genuinely significant development in Regency women's lives. They lost their pockets. Pre-Regency dress featured large pockets sewn into underskirts, accessible through slits in the outer skirt, not glamorous, but functional. When the silhouette narrowed into the high-waisted column, there was no room for pockets. They disappeared. In their place appeared the reticule, a small separate purse carried in the hand, drawstring topped, usually decorated, frequently embroidered. It was called, rather unkindly, a reticule by people who thought visible purse carrying was undignified. But women carried on. What matters about the reticule is what it contained and what that content communicated. Smelling salts for the woman who had learned that a timely feint could exit a great many inconvenient situations. A small notebook, a calling card case, folded letters, carefully chosen ones, a pressed flower from someone whose name you were not yet in a position to speak aloud. The reticule was essentially a woman's private archive, small enough to carry in public. The loss of the pocket was not, in the grand scheme of Regency women's constraints, the most significant injustice they faced. But it was a material one, and the reticule that replaced it was a distinctly inferior solution. A pocket is internal and invisible. A reticule is external and visible, which means that whatever you carry is, in a sense, on display. Not its contents, but the bag itself, its size, its decoration, its apparent weight, all of which communicated information to the room. A very small, very elegant reticule said, "I carry almost nothing, because I require almost nothing, because I am entirely provided for and have no need of practical objects on my person." A slightly more substantial reticule said, "I am a woman who moves through the world with a degree of self-sufficiency which was either admirable or slightly alarming depending on who was reading it." The decoration of the reticule was an opportunity for the same communicative needlework that appeared throughout Regency women's material culture. An embroidered reticule was personal, handmade, expressive. A beaded reticule was fashionable and expensive. A plain cloth one was practical or economical. The reticule came out at precisely the moments when you were most publicly visible, at balls, at morning calls, at the opera, and was handled throughout those occasions in ways that were themselves visible. Retrieving a calling card with composure and grace was a small performance. Fumbling at the drawstring was a small failure. Everything, always, was being observed and assessed. What the reticule contained told its own story to anyone who happened to see inside, which could happen, and which meant that the contents were curated with some care by women who understood that the private and the public had very thin walls between them in this world. A woman carrying a novel in her reticule was identifying herself as a reader. A woman carrying a small sketchbook was identifying herself as an artist. A woman carrying an unusually large quantity of letters was either very popular or managing a significant correspondence, and either reading was interesting. The smelling salts were universal, practical, and occasionally theatrical. The strategic feint was a recognized tool of social navigation, requiring only the preparatory smelling salts and a reasonable confidence in the people present to respond correctly. It was, if you think about it, an emergency exit disguised as a medical incident, and the reticule made it available at all times. The pockets had offered more room. The reticule offered more visibility, more control, and occasionally more drama. Women made the trade and carried their archives elegantly forward into every room the season required. The morning call was not a casual visit. Nothing in Regency social life was casual. Everything was choreographed, and the morning call was one of the most precisely choreographed rituals of all. You arrived, not in the actual morning, which would have been absurd, but between 11 and 2 in the afternoon, because this was the Regency, and the word morning had a somewhat elastic relationship with the clock. You were admitted, you sat for 15 to 30 minutes, you said pleasant and not too personal things, you left. The entire visit was over before it threatened to become intimate, and for all of this, you dressed as carefully as if you were attending a dinner. The morning visiting dress was different from your evening wear, different from your promenade dress, different from your carriage dress. It was day clothing but not house clothing, presentable but not overdressed. The line was narrow, and getting it wrong, arriving in something too elaborate or too informal or too evocative of an evening you'd apparently just come from, was immediately noticed and discussed at the next morning call by everyone who'd been present at this one. The morning call existed to maintain the social network, to keep connections alive, to demonstrate continued interest in a relationship, to gather and disseminate the information that kept the social world functioning. It was, in the most functional sense, networking with better furniture. And like all networking, the first impression mattered enormously. You were assessed from the moment you were shown into the drawing room. The condition of your dress, the fashionability of your accessories, the precision with which you had calibrated the formality of your appearance to the occasion and the household. Arriving at the home of a person significantly above your social station in something too simple was a failure of respect. Arriving at the home of a close friend in something too elaborate was a failure of ease. The calibration was everything. The duration of the call was itself a communication. 15 minutes was the polite minimum, sufficient to have called, insufficient to have stayed. 30 minutes was comfortable and interested. Longer than 30 minutes, unless specifically invited to stay, was a bold move that required careful management of the conversation to avoid the impression that you had not noticed the hostess glancing at the clock. Leaving at the correct moment was as important as arriving in the correct dress. Both announce your social fluency. A woman who called at the right time, stayed the right length, said the right things, and left without appearing to. Count the minutes had demonstrated a social precision that was genuinely difficult to acquire and immediately legible to everyone present. The calling card was the dress code's paper companion, left by the footman when the hostess was not at home, or formally presented upon arrival. It announced you in miniature. The card was engraved, correct, and clean. Its condition communicated your household's management. A creased or dirty calling card was an embarrassment in the same register as a wrinkled gown, small but noticed, and added to the running account the social world was keeping of every observable detail about you. The morning call was, when you add it all up, a complete performance in a very short time frame. Correct dress, correct timing, correct duration, correct card, correct conversation, correct exit. Women executed it daily across the season, sometimes multiple times in a single afternoon. It was exhausting, invisible labour in service of a social position that required constant maintenance, or it quietly ceased to exist. The clothes were just the most visible part of the machinery. If the ballroom was where matches were made, Hyde Park between 5 and 6 in the afternoon was where they were publicly previewed. The fashionable promenade was, at its core, a structured performance of availability and status, on horseback, on foot, or in an open carriage, the last being ideal because it let you be seen without being approachable in quite the same way. The rules of the promenade were unwritten but absolute. You bowed to people you knew. You nodded to people you sort of knew. You looked straight ahead past people you were cutting, which was a devastating social manoeuvre and required absolute confidence of execution. And you wore your best day clothes because this was public, daylit, and subject to scrutiny that was both immediate and retrospective. People went home from the park and wrote letters describing what they'd seen and who'd been wearing what and what this might mean about the current state of their fortunes, health, or romantic situation. The open carriage was the optimal promenade vehicle, because it combined visibility with a degree of physical remove. You could be seen from every angle without being directly accessible. A passing acquaintance could bow from horseback. You could incline your head graciously from your barouche, and the entire exchange could constitute a social acknowledgement without requiring either party to stop, dismount, and endure a conversation. It was social contact at a comfortable velocity. For women managing multiple simultaneous social negotiations, the gentleman you were encouraging, the one you were discouraging, the one whose family you had not yet decided about, the carriage promenade was the most efficiently managed version of public visibility available. You were present, you were seen, you were in motion before anyone could corner you. Dress for the promenade was specifically calibrated for daylight and distance. Colours that read beautifully in candlelight at an evening ball could look quite different in the afternoon sun. A strong blue that had seemed elegant across a ballroom might look slightly aggressive in the park. Pale colours read softly and pleasantly in daylight, and were accordingly popular for afternoon wear. The pelisse and bonnet were the promenade's defining garments, both designed for outdoor wear, both visible from a significant distance, both subject to the particular scrutiny of people who had nothing to do for an hour but observe who was in the park and what they were wearing. The bonnet specifically was doing crucial work, managing the angle of visibility, controlling which direction your face was turned, and communicating through its trimming and style the same messages it communicated everywhere else, now at a viewing distance that required the messages to be somewhat broader to be legible. Being seen in Hyde Park required strategic commitment. You could not simply appear, you appeared deliberately, at the fashionable hour, in a fashionable equipage, in correct dress, with the correct companions. The companions mattered. Being seen in the park in the company of a person of high social standing elevated you. Being seen in the company of someone whose reputation was questionable lowered you, and the lowering was immediate and public. You chose your carriage companions the way you chose your dress, with awareness of what the combination would communicate to the people watching, and the people watching were always watching. Hyde Park at 5 in the afternoon was several hundred people simultaneously performing and observing, all pretending that they were simply taking the air. Nobody, in Regency England, was simply taking the air. Jewellery in the Regency era followed a logic that was partly aesthetic, partly sentimental, and partly communicative in ways that modern jewellery wearing mostly isn't. The classical influence that governed dress also governed ornament. Simple gold, cameos, delicate chains, seed pearls. Diamonds were for formal occasions and established women. A young unmarried woman dripping in diamonds looked either newly engaged, newly inherited, or like she was trying to make a point. Pearls communicated innocence, purity, and an old family. Coral was thought to ward off evil and was given to children and young women in vulnerable positions. Semi-precious coloured stones, turquoise, garnet, topaz, were personal and fashion-forward. But the most intimate and loaded piece of jewellery in a Regency woman's collection was the miniature. A tiny portrait painted on ivory or enamel, worn on a chain, pinned to a dress, or kept in a locket. A miniature of a particular person said without any words at all, "This person matters to me more than I am able to state in public." Gold was the default metal of Regency jewellery, and its quality was readable. Fine gold in a clean, classical setting communicated taste and restraint. The fashionable preference for simple forms meant that elaborate, heavily decorated pieces were considered slightly old-fashioned, slightly too emphatic, slightly redolent of the previous century's preference for ornamentation over elegance. A woman in a plain gold chain with a single pendant was more current than a woman in multiple heavy necklaces layered in the manner of the 1780s. Simplicity was the contemporary statement. The simplicity, however, had to be of the expensive kind. Fine gold, correctly worked, precisely fitted, because cheap simplicity and expensive simplicity looked entirely different to a practiced eye, and the eyes in any fashionable room were uniformly practiced. Cameos occupied a particular position in the Regency jewellery landscape, carved in shell or stone, depicting classical profiles, goddesses, emperors, mythological scenes. A cameo was simultaneously a fashion accessory and a statement of intellectual alignment with the classical revival that governed the whole aesthetic moment. Wearing a cameo said, "I am educated enough to know what this is, fashionable enough to wear it correctly, and sufficiently connected to the cultural conversation to understand why antiquity is currently the relevant reference point." It was a small piece of stone doing a remarkable amount of cultural work. Women had them set into brooches, into bracelets, into the clasps of their belts. They appeared at the throat, at the wrist, in the hair. The cameo was everywhere, and its omnipresence was itself a statement about the era's relationship with the past it was borrowing from. Seed pearls, tiny, perfectly matched, strung in delicate arrangements, were the jewellery of the young and unmarried. Light enough not to overwhelm a white muslin gown, refined enough to demonstrate good taste, expensive enough to demonstrate adequate resources, they occupied the ideal middle register for a woman who was presenting herself as eligible rather than established. A young woman in seed pearls was dressed correctly for her position. A young woman in something more dramatic was either announcing an engagement, demonstrating excessive confidence, or had a mother who had made a miscalculation. The pearls, in the context of the marriage market, were a kind of modest opening bid. Here I am, appropriately presented, waiting to see what the room will offer. The miniature portrait deserves its own extended attention, because no other piece of jewellery in the Regency period carried more emotional freight in a smaller physical space. Painted by specialist artists on a disc of ivory no larger than a pocket watch face, miniatures were the photographs of their era, the only way to carry a likeness of someone with you into every room. Wearing someone's miniature at your throat was a declaration of connection so intimate that it required some social management. A miniature of a parent or a sibling was unambiguous and uncontroversial. A miniature of a young man, who had not yet declared himself, was a rumour Warner's jewellery, and the room would notice it and draw its own conclusions before you'd said a word. There was a whole category of Regency object that sits somewhere between jewellery and letter, the sentimental keepsake, and it was worn, displayed, and exchanged with a level of emotional significance that can seem startling to modern sensibilities. The most intimate of these was the hair token. Locks of hair were cut from loved ones, a sweetheart, a deceased child, a mother, a friend departing for India with the East India Company, and woven, braided, or set into rings, brooches, and bracelets. Wearing someone's hair was not morbid. It was an assertion of connection. It said, "This person is part of my body now, in the only sense available to me." A widow wearing her late husband's hair in a brooch at her collar was making a visible, legible statement about her devotion and her grief. A young woman wearing a ring containing a young man's hair was either engaged, nearly engaged, or the subject of considerable parental alarm, depending on how much the young man's family knew about the ring. The craft of hair work was a recognised art in the Regency period, and its practitioners were skilled. Hair could be braided into flat bands and set under glass in brooches. It could be woven into watch chains, into rings, into the borders of lockets that opened to reveal a miniature portrait with a curl of hair pressed behind the ivory. The techniques were specific and varied enough that a practiced eye could assess the quality of the work, and quality communicated investment, which communicated the significance of the relationship the token represented. A carelessly braided bit of hair in a cheap setting communicated something different from a precisely woven arrangement in fine gold. Both were hair tokens. Both were saying the same essential thing. But they were saying it in different registers, with different implications about the seriousness of the feeling they encoded. The exchange of hair tokens followed its own etiquette that existed just at the border of the formal and the dangerously informal. Between women, friends, sisters, mothers and daughters, the exchange was entirely acceptable and widely practiced. Between a woman and a man who had not declared himself, it was charged. To give a man a lock of your hair was to give him something irreversibly personal. It could not be ungiven, and its existence in his possession was a fact that could be produced as evidence of intimacy if the relationship later became contested. Women in the period's correspondence write with great care about the decision to give or accept hair tokens, aware of the implications. It was the kind of gesture that felt private and was in fact deeply public once it existed in the world. Forget-me-not bracelets and pieces worked with the blue enamel or real flowers of the forget-me-not occupied similar territory, worn on the wrist, visible every time the arm moved. They announced continuously, "I am thinking of someone. I am connected to someone. I am not, in the emotional sense, entirely available." A woman in forget-me-not jewellery at a ball was surrounded by a visible declaration of prior attachment, real or aspirational. Whether the attachment was to a living man, a departed friend, or a deceased relative, the piece said the same thing. There is someone already in this space, and the room read it accordingly. What is striking about the whole sentimental keepsake tradition is how much emotional labour it was doing in a world that offered very few other official channels for women's feeling. You could not write publicly about your grief or your love. You could not speak about it freely in mixed company. You could not, in most cases, act on it directly and independently, but you could wear it. You could carry it on your wrist, at your throat, in your locket, pressed against your skin beneath your glove, and it was yours, intimate and deniable and entirely present, in every room the day required you to enter. The keepsake was not a substitute for the feeling. It was the feeling made wearable, which in Regency England was often the most honest form of expression available. If you were a young, unmarried woman making your way through the Regency marriage market, white was your fundamental uniform. Not exclusively. You could wear pale pastels, soft muslins in blush or lavender, but white was your baseline, your return to neutral, your statement of untouched eligibility. The symbolism was obvious, and everyone understood it. What's less obvious is how much work went into making white look natural. White muslin soils immediately and visibly. White requires constant laundering in an era where laundering meant hauling water and scrubbing by hand. White at a ball, after dancing in candlelight in the summer heat, white showed everything, which meant that a woman in pristine white after an evening's worth of activity had either not danced, not exerted herself, had excellent laundresses, or had managed the entire evening with a composure that amounted to a kind of performance in itself. The whiteness was the point. Impeccable white said, "I am cared for, I am controlled. I have not been in any situation that would require explaining." The gradations of white were predictably a subject of considerable refinement. Pure white, the bright, stark white of freshly laundered fine cotton, was the most demanding option. It required the best fabric, the most attentive laundering, and a figure that looked well in something that offered absolutely no assistance from colour. Cream was slightly softer and more forgiving, associated with slightly older fabrics or a slightly warmer complexion. Ivory fell between them. The distinctions were subtle enough that a casual observer might not register them, but a practised one would, and in any fashionable room there were exclusively practised observers. Wearing the wrong shade of white, if such a thing could be said to exist, was not a catastrophe. It was simply noted. Everything was noted. The fabric of a white gown carried its own hierarchy entirely separate from the colour. Fine Indian muslin at the top, sheer, draping, expensive, the best possible argument for the classical silhouette. Domestic muslin below it, adequate, correct, less remarkable. Cotton lawn was respectable. Cheaper cotton was functional but not fashionable. The white told everyone you were correct. The fabric told everyone how correct, and at what cost, and with what connections, which were three quite different pieces of information that the gown was delivering simultaneously in the single apparent statement of, "I am wearing white." Trimmings on white gowns were the primary vehicle for individual expression within the constraint of the colour. Lace at the hem and sleeves was refinement. Embroidered borders in white-on-white whitework were skilled and personal. Coloured ribbon trim introduced a controlled note of individuality. The shade of the ribbon was its own communication within the floral and colour vocabularies running alongside all of this. A white gown with blue ribbon trim was saying something specific. The same gown with green ribbon said something different. The white was the required baseline. What you did with the trim was where your personality was permitted to appear, carefully within the constraint. What the white uniform did when you stand back and look at it was create a system in which all young unmarried women started from the same visible baseline and were then differentiated by the quality of the fabric, the skill of the trim, the precision of the laundering, and the composure with which they wore it. It was a level playing field that was not, in any meaningful sense, level at all, because the resources required to wear white well were significant and unequally distributed, but it maintained the fiction of equality while encoding the reality of difference in every detail, which was an efficient piece of social engineering dressed up with considerable irony in the colour of innocence. If unmarried women were dressed in the language of possibility and constraint, widows were dressed in something altogether more complicated. A widow's first year of mourning confined her to unrelieved black crepe bombazine, matte, and expensive, and enormously visible. But after that first year, a widow entered a world of relative freedom that was almost unique among women of her class. She had been married, which conferred status. She was now unmarried, which conferred mobility. If her husband had left her anything at all, she controlled her own money for the first time in her adult life, and all of this showed up in how she dressed once she emerged from full mourning. A widow at half mourning in lavender and grey, with a certain precision and confidence in her choices, was communicating something that no unmarried girl could. I have learned what I want and I am in a position to pursue it, which was, in the context of Regency England, an extraordinarily free thing to be wearing. The first year of mourning was, for many widows, genuinely constraining, not merely socially but practically. You were confined largely to home. Social engagements were limited or entirely suspended. The crepe and bombazine that constituted correct full mourning were expensive, uncomfortable, and absorbed rather than reflected your social environment, which was precisely the point. You were visibly withdrawn from the world. The world, in return, treated you with a solicitousness that was both kind and faintly imprisoning. You were the grieving widow, and the role had its own complete costume, its own schedule, its own set of acceptable behaviours that were communicated entirely through what you wore. The transition through half mourning was a gradual reintroduction to visibility that a widow could manage with considerable agency if she chose to. Moving from black to grey was a statement that the acute phase of grief had passed, and that she was, cautiously, rejoining the social world. Moving from grey to lavender was a step further, lavender being a colour close enough to mourning to remain respectable, but distinct enough to announce that the wearer was beginning to think about what came next. The specific timing of these transitions was watched and assessed, but a widow of sufficient social confidence could manage the pace in ways that served her interests. Moving quickly through mourning could signal a certain independence of spirit. Lingering in it could signal continued devotion to the deceased, or could function as protective colouring while she figured out her next move. Both options were available. She chose. A wealthy widow in half mourning was, by the social logic of her era, a powerful figure. She had money she controlled. She had a social position she had earned through marriage. She had experience of the world that no unmarried girl possessed. And she was visibly in a transitional state, not fully committed to mourning, not yet fully re-entered into the social field, which gave her a mobility that the strict categories governing other women's lives did not. She could decline invitations without explanation. She could accept them selectively. She could dress with a precision and intention that announced competence and judgment rather than hopeful availability. The lavender gown was doing all of this simultaneously, in a colour soft enough to seem gentle, and a cut precise enough to announce that gentle was only part of the picture. There were women in Regency England who used the mourning period not only to grieve, but to plan. Who used the black crepe as a legitimate reason to withdraw from the social world long enough to assess their situation, their resources, and their options with a clarity that the constant performance demands of active social life did not easily permit. Who emerged from full mourning into half mourning's lavender and grey, having made decisions that the first year had given them the space to reach. The dress did not make the plan, but it made the space in which the planning could happen, which was its own quiet form of power. There is a particular form of social performance available only to those who are entirely secure in their status, and it consists of dressing as though you simply couldn't be bothered. In Regency England, this was an art form. The truly fashionable, the women who set trends rather than followed them, occasionally appeared in something so simple, so understated, so carefully underdone that it took a very educated eye to understand what they had actually spent. An exquisitely cut white gown with no ornamentation whatsoever was not cheap. Its simplicity required perfect fabric, perfect drape, a modiste of genuine skill, and the kind of figure that doesn't need assistance. A woman who appeared in something that appeared effortless had usually put more thought into it than the woman in 3 kinds of trimming. This was the Regency equivalent of the extremely expensive plain black turtleneck, a power move dressed up as restraint, a statement about how far above the competition you were that you didn't need to state it. The social logic of strategic simplicity was this. Ornamentation was, in a sense, effort made visible. Trimming announced that you had worked to be fashionable, that you'd spent money on ribbons and lace, and embroidered borders. It was correct and respectable, but it revealed the machinery. The woman in a perfectly plain gown of exquisite fabric was revealing nothing. She appeared to have simply arrived, as though the clothes had arranged themselves around her without fuss, which suggested a level of natural authority that trim and ornament could not purchase regardless of their quality. Nature was always the highest Regency compliment. The appearance of nature was the highest Regency achievement. The danger of strategic simplicity was that it required absolute execution to succeed. A plain gown in fine fabric read as sophisticated restraint. A plain gown in mediocre fabric read as insufficient resources. The difference between them was everything, and it was legible to every practiced eye in the room, which was, again, every eye in the room. A woman who attempted the elegant simplicity move without the budget to support it did not read as effortlessly above it all. She read as unable to afford the trimming, which was the opposite of the intended communication, and a considerably more embarrassing one. The simplicity gambit required you to actually have everything you were pretending not to need. Fashion has always been unkind to bluff. This was the territory of the truly established, women who had long since passed the moment of needing to announce their position, and could now demonstrate it through the very act of not demonstrating it. Lady patronesses at Almack's, hostesses whose social authority was so secured that they could receive in something understated, and the room would understand that the understatement was itself the statement. Great beauties who wore simple white because they understood perfectly well that the gown was not the point. Women old enough and confident enough to have moved entirely beyond the anxiety of the marriage market and into the equally interesting territory of simply being, visibly and securely, themselves. What is worth noting about this particular expression of fashion is how completely it inverted the usual logic of dress as announcement. Most Regency fashion communicated by adding more trim, more colour, more carefully chosen accessories accumulating into a legible total picture. Strategic simplicity communicated by subtracting, which required you to trust that the room would read the absence correctly. That trust was itself a form of power. You had to believe that what you were not wearing would be understood. Most women in the room were working too hard to afford that kind of confidence. The women who had it wore it like the most expensive thing in their wardrobes, which, in the end, it usually was. In Regency England, the gap between London fashion and what was available to women in the country was not merely aesthetic. It was temporal, sometimes by months, often by a year or more. Fashion plates circulated through the magazines, yes, but seeing a picture of a sleeve and having a local seamstress interpret it was a different thing entirely from having a London modiste execute it in the correct fabric with the correct trim. A woman fresh from London was identifiable. A woman fresh from the country was identifiable too, and while this wasn't necessarily shameful, it did communicate something about access, about connections, about how recently she'd been in a position to spend money on keeping current. The season, in part, existed to solve this problem. Coming to London for the season was partly about matrimonial opportunity, and partly about the chance to acquire dress, to update yourself, to return to your county in October wearing something that would not immediately announce you as a woman who hadn't been anywhere interesting in 2 years. The provincial seamstress did her best, and in many cases her best was genuinely skilled. The problem was not always execution, it was information. She was working from fashion plates that had arrived weeks after publication, interpreting a silhouette from a single printed image without access to the original fabric, the original trim, the original proportions as executed by the London modiste whose work the plate was attempting to represent. The result was often technically competent and subtly wrong. The sleeves a fraction too large, the waist placed a half-inch too low, the trim in a colour that was close to fashionable, but not precisely fashionable, like a translation that captures every word but misses the tone. A London eye caught it immediately. The provincial woman wearing it often could not see the difference until she walked into a fashionable room and felt the small, specific chill of being almost correct. The season shopping expedition was one of the primary practical purposes of the London visit, and mothers and daughters approached it with a strategic seriousness that matched any military campaign. You arrived with a budget and a list. You visited the modiste first, the correct modiste, the one whose name appeared in letters of recommendation and fashion columns, whose address communicated your own seriousness about the project. You ordered the gowns that would carry you through the season. You acquired the accessories that would complete them, and you did all of this early enough that the work would be finished before the first significant event of the season required you to appear in something that would announce whether your family had, this year, made the investment. Returning to the country at the season's end in correctly fashionable dress was its own social statement within the local context. You arrived back in your county wearing London, which elevated you in the local hierarchy and served as evidence of the season's success, social if not matrimonial. The gowns you brought back circulated through local assemblies and morning calls, where they were read by women who had not been to London and who assessed them with the particular sharpness of people, evaluating something they cannot themselves access. The London dress was both fashion and souvenir, evidence of where you had been and what that had cost, worn on the body where everyone could see it and draw their own conclusions about what the season had ultimately produced. The Regency era saw a significant expansion of women's fashion publishing. La Belle Assemblée, Ackermann's Repository, The Ladies' Magazine, these publications circulated fashion plates, descriptions of new styles, and commentary on what the fashionable were wearing with a regularity and reach that was genuinely new. This matters because it began to democratize the code. If fashion had previously been the exclusive property of those with London connections and the money to shop there, fashion plates meant that a woman in Yorkshire could see, within a few months, what was being worn at Almack's and could instruct her local seamstress accordingly. This created something interesting. A broader population of women who understood the vocabulary. It also created something slightly troubling for those at the top of the system. If everyone could read the same magazine, the code became both more legible and more imitable, which meant the women who had originally controlled it had to keep moving, keep refining, keep developing new signals to distinguish themselves from the women who were learning to speak their language. The fashion plate itself was a remarkable object, a hand-coloured engraving depicting one or two figures in the latest styles, posed with the slightly rigid elegance of illustrations that were communicating information more than capturing life. They showed the silhouette, the trim, the accessories, and often included a written description of the fabrics and colours used, the occasion for which the dress was appropriate, and occasionally some editorial commentary about why this particular arrangement of sleeve and sash represented a significant development in the current aesthetic conversation. Reading a fashion plate required interpretive skill. You had to understand what the illustration was trying to show you and translate that into instructions for a real seamstress working with real fabric. This was a learned competency, and the magazines that published the plates were simultaneously providing the decoder ring. Ackermann's Repository was perhaps the most ambitious of these publications. It covered not only fashion but interior decoration, literature and the arts, presenting fashionable dress as part of a larger fashionable life that extended from what you wore to how your drawing room was furnished to what you were reading. This was significant because it framed fashion not as superficial vanity, but as one element of a cultivated, intelligent existence. And in doing so, it gave women who consumed it a framework for thinking about their own self-presentation as a form of aesthetic expression rather than merely social compliance. The woman reading Ackermann's was being told implicitly that her choices mattered, that they were connected to a broader cultural conversation, that she was a participant in something larger than the marriage market's immediate demands. The democratization had its limits, of course. A fashion plate showing a gown in finest silk was accessible to anyone who could afford the magazine subscription. The gown itself remained accessible only to those who could afford the silk, the modiste, and the season. The magazine spread the vocabulary without spreading the resources required to speak it fluently, which meant it created a new tier of partially informed aspirants, women who knew exactly what was fashionable and exactly why they could not afford it, which was in some ways more frustrating than simply not knowing. Knowledge without access has always been its own specific form of exclusion. The fashion magazines democratized the dream considerably more than they democratized the reality. But the dream, once widely shared, became part of how the culture understood itself, and that shift, however incomplete, was genuinely new. Not every woman who broke the dress code did so by accident. Some of the most interesting figures in Regency social history are the ones who wore something deliberately contrary and understood exactly what they were doing. Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter, the future Mary Shelley, moved in circles where unconventional dress was a form of philosophical statement. Lady Caroline Lamb, erratic, brilliant, catastrophically attached to Lord Byron, famously dressed in ways that announced her difference from conventional femininity, including appearing at various points in male clothing. The blue stockings of the previous generation had established a tradition of women who wore plain, intellectual dress as a way of saying, "I am not here to be decorative." The Regency woman who chose foreign styles during the war years, or who wore mourning for longer than convention dictated, or who appeared in something too bold or too simple or too deliberate, she was often not confused about the rules. She understood them completely. The choice not to follow them was the communication. Lady Caroline Lamb is perhaps the most vivid example of dress as deliberate social disruption. Her appearance in male clothing, Page's costume at various points, cropped hair when cropped hair on a woman was still unusual enough to be remarkable, was not fashion forwardness in the conventional sense. It was a declaration of refusal. I will not perform the femininity your social codes require. The performance itself paradoxically required as much deliberate construction as conventional feminine dress. You did not accidentally appear in a page's costume. You chose it, assembled it, wore it in public, and accepted the consequences, which in Lady Caroline's case were significant, and which she appeared to find at least partly worth it. She was reading the code perfectly. She was simply annotating it with her disagreement. The blue stocking tradition, which had flourished in the second half of the 18th century among educated women like Elizabeth Montagu and Hannah More, had established plain, unfussy dress as the aesthetic signature of intellectual seriousness. A woman who dressed simply and without fashionable ornament was announcing that her mind was elsewhere, engaged with literature, philosophy, political economy, the things that the fashionable world considered inappropriate female preoccupations. The plainness of dress was a form of protest against the demand that women spend their attention on appearance rather than ideas. It was also, of course, a highly constructed aesthetic choice that required as much thought as the fashionable alternative, which is the eternal irony of deliberate plainness. The refusal to be decorative is itself a decoration. Women who wore French styles during the Napoleonic Wars were making a different kind of statement, one less clearly legible, more contextually dependent. French fashion was the international standard, and many women continued to follow it on aesthetic grounds that had nothing to do with politics. But in the heated atmosphere of wartime patriotism, wearing French styles was read as a statement regardless of the wearer's intent, which meant that the women who continued to wear them had either decided the political reading was not their problem, or had decided it was precisely their problem, and were making a point about the absurdity of conflating fashion with loyalty. Either reading was possible, both were interesting. The dress code, deliberately violated or simply indifferently exceeded, was at its most revealing when someone chose not to follow it, because the choice showed, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what the code had been requiring all along. It is worth dwelling on the consequences, because the consequences were real. A woman who dressed wrongly in Regency England, too fast, too provincial, too poor, too try-hard, too foreign, too indifferent, didn't just receive a raised eyebrow. She received it from everyone present simultaneously, and then they went home and wrote about it. The letters of Jane Austen are full of it. Careful, precise, occasionally gleeful descriptions of what other women were wearing and what it revealed about their situation, their taste, and their sense. Social reputation in this era was genuinely fragile, and dress was one of the most visible components of it. A woman who appeared at Almack's in the wrong dress on a Wednesday night might not be turned away, but she might spend the rest of the season watching the consequences ripple outward through who called on her, who danced with her, and who used that single sartorial misstep as evidence of a broader unsuitability. The stakes were matrimonial, which meant the stakes were economic, which meant the stakes were essentially everything. Jane Austen's letters to her sister Cassandra are among the most valuable surviving records of how this social observation actually operated in practice. Her descriptions of other women's dress are sharp, specific, and rarely entirely kind. She notes the wrong cap on a woman who should have known better, the excessive trim on a gown that announces its owner's insecurity as clearly as a confession. She's not cruel exactly, but she is precise, and the precision reveals how thoroughly the dress code was understood and how automatically its violations were registered. This was not malicious gossip for its own sake, though it was certainly that too. It was social information of practical value. What a woman wore told you something real about her situation and her judgment, and knowing those things mattered for navigating your own social position correctly. The mechanisms of consequence were informal but efficient. A sartorial misstep was discussed at the next morning call, in letters home, in the kind of quiet conversational circulation that moved faster than any official announcement. By the time a woman arrived at the following week's assembly, the assessment of her Wednesday dress had already made its rounds, and the people in the room had already incorporated it into their working picture of her. She might notice nothing specific. No single person was unkind, no direct comment was made, but the quality of attention she received had shifted slightly. The number of introductions had decreased marginally. The warmth of the existing connections had cooled by a degree or two. None of it was measurable, all of it was felt. The particular cruelty of this system was that it operated entirely through implication and never through explicit statement. A woman could not defend herself against a charge that was never formally brought. She could not correct a mistake that was never directly named. She could only observe the consequences and attempt to reverse them through subsequent correct dress, correct behaviour, correct management of every visible aspect of her presentation, and even then, the reversal was not guaranteed because the social whirl that had noted the error was under no obligation to note the correction with equal enthusiasm. Getting it wrong once was a fact. Getting it right subsequently was merely expected. The asymmetry was absolute and entirely understood by everyone operating within the system, which made correct dress not a vanity, but a form of self-protection, exercised daily, with no days off, for the full duration of every season you needed to survive. Here is what's worth sitting with as we wind down through this world of empire waists and coded bonnets and fans deployed like diplomatic dispatches. Regency women were not playing a small game. They were operating in the only arena available to them with the full force of their intelligence, their creativity, and their political awareness. They could not vote, could not speak at public meetings, could not publish under their own names without social risk, could not enter most of the official structures through which power was exercised. So they worked the rooms, they decoded the rooms, they built and defended and occasionally dismantled their positions within the rooms through every tool the rooms provided, and the most publicly visible of those tools was dress. The woman who chose her colours with care, who understood that a kashmir shawl communicated differently from a Norwich copy, who knew exactly how much the tilt of a bonnet brim was telling the world about her mood or her intentions. She was not being trivial, she was being precise. She was speaking the language of her world fluently, strategically, and sometimes brilliantly. And she was doing it from inside a corset, in shoes without adequate arch support after a breakfast she probably didn't eat enough of. Which, honestly, is impressive. The dress code was not something imposed purely from outside, though it was certainly enforced from outside with considerable ruthlessness. It was also, and perhaps more fundamentally, a system that women themselves maintained, refined, and sometimes subverted, because the women at the top of the social hierarchy had as much interest in the code's integrity as anyone. The lady patronesses of Almack's were not simply enforcers of an external standard. They were the standard. They set it, they embodied it, and they protected it, because the code was also their power. A system that could read a woman's status from the fabric of her pelisse was a system that rewarded those who controlled the definition of correct fabric. The women who understood the code most completely were simultaneously its most accomplished practitioners and its most interested guardians. What this means, when you take it seriously, is that the fashion of Regency England was a form of governance. Not formal governance, not law, not policy, but governance in the sense that it organised people, communicated status, enforced norms, rewarded compliance, and punished deviation. It was a distributed system with no single authority and no written rules, maintained entirely through social observation and social consequence. And it was administered primarily by women, within the domestic and social spaces that were the only ones available to them. The drawing room was not a lesser version of Parliament. It was a different kind of Parliament entirely, with its own procedures and its own authority, and the women who ran it were legislators in the only legislature that would have them. There is a reason that Jane Austen's novels, the sharpest, most precise accounts of this world that survive, are not primarily about love, despite appearing to be about nothing else. They are about power, who has it, who wants it, who loses it, and how the small visible details of dress and manner and social navigation determine which of these outcomes arrives for each person in the room. Austen understood the dress code the way a master chess player understands the board, not as decoration, but as the actual game. Her heroines navigate it with varying degrees of success and self-awareness, and their navigation is the drama. The women of Regency England were not waiting for a better world in which they could speak directly. They were speaking constantly and precisely in the language the world had given them. The fan, the bonnet, the kashmir shawl, the seed pearls, the carefully chosen ribbon trim, all of it was speech. All of it was argument. All of it was, in the fullest sense of the word, communication carried out with discipline, intelligence, and a kind of daily courage that required showing up, correctly dressed, and saying what needed to be said, in the only language anyone in the room was prepared to hear. And so, as the last candle gutters down in the drawing room and the final guest has made her exit, bonnet correctly tied, pelisse precisely draped, fan folded and returned to the reticule, let's take a moment to sit with what we've actually spent this evening exploring. You've just spent a night inside one of the most elaborate, demanding and quietly brilliant communication systems in human history. A world where the colour of a ribbon was a sentence, where the tilt of a hat brim was a decision, where a woman could conduct an entire negotiation across a ballroom using nothing but a folding piece of painted silk and the precise direction of her gaze, where the difference between a Norwich shawl and a cashmere one communicated more about a family's connections and resources than most people would say aloud in a year. These women woke up every morning and got dressed for battle, not the kind with mud and cannon fire, the kind that required more sustained intelligence, more precise calibration, and more unrelenting attention to detail than most official battlefields ever demanded. They did it with no official recognition, no formal title, no institutional support, and no ability to simply say what they meant in the direct, unguarded way that would have made everything considerably easier and considerably less interesting. They were fluent in a language most of the men around them couldn't even read. They ran a social system of extraordinary complexity from inside spaces the world had decided were small. They argued, negotiated, competed, supported, subverted, and occasionally dismantled each other's positions using fabric and flowers and the angle of a bonnet brim. And they did it every single day, season after season, with the composure of people who understood perfectly well that composure itself was part of the argument. So tonight, as you pull your blanket up and let the day go quiet, maybe spare a thought for the woman in the white muslin gown, standing at the edge of a candlelit ballroom in 1814. She has spent an hour dressing for this. She knows exactly what her gown is saying, what her seed pearls are saying, what the single sprig of forget-me-not at her bodice is saying to the one person in the room who knows how to read it. She is 20 years old. She cannot vote. She cannot own property. She cannot say, plainly and directly, the thing she has come here to say. So she's wearing it instead. And somewhere across the room, someone is reading it perfectly. History is full of people who change the world loudly, with speeches and swords and grand declarative gestures that made it into the official record. But it is also full of people who change their worlds quietly, precisely, and daily, using whatever language was available to them. The women of Regency England were among the latter. And the next time you choose what to wear with unusual care, the next time you pick a colour for a reason you don't quite say out loud, or arrange yourself for a room with more deliberateness than the occasion technically requires, you are, in the smallest and most human way, doing exactly what they did, speaking the only language the room will hear. Good night.